Good morning, and welcome to the Johns Hopkins briefing. Today's briefing will focus on wildfires and air quality. My name is Lainey Rutko, and I'm Vice Provost for Interdisciplinary Initiatives at Johns Hopkins University. I'll be moderating today's briefing, and I'm speaking to you today from a slightly hazy Baltimore. The consequences of wildfires occurring across Canada do not stop at that nation's borders. As so many of us have seen over the last few days, there are visible changes in air quality, and many of us are asking about the long-term health impact on populations, how we should be thinking about masking protocols, and how to mitigate these types of events in the future. It's vital that proper guidance is given and information from experts is disseminated so we know how to respond today and as this crisis continues to unfold. I'm pleased to be joined by several of my colleagues from across Johns Hopkins. Peter DeCarlo is an associate professor at the Johns Hopkins Whiting School of Engineering. Kirsten Koehler is an associate professor at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And Meredith McCormack is an associate professor at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. Before I turn to each of our panelists for their initial thoughts, I want to remind our audience we will be providing answers to your questions in real time today. So please submit questions for our experts in the box that you see at the bottom of your screen. When you do so, if possible, please include your organizational affiliation. We're going to start by having each of our panelists give a brief overview of key topics, and then we'll transition to Q&A. Peter, I'm going to turn to you first. We're in the midst of a dramatic example of air pollution with significant impacts on air quality. What do you see as the most pressing concerns in the days and weeks ahead?
I think as people have seen in the last few days that what we really want to do right now is minimize our exposure to the air pollution that's coming from this wildfire smoke. So that's going to be our main concern. But keep in mind the air quality impacts are day to day and even hour to hour, and we can see dramatic swings in the levels of air pollution outside. Today, especially in comparison to the last few days, is pretty good. And although this time of year we typically do see better air quality than we have right now. I think the thing to be concerned with in the short term has a lot to do with the weather. These fires are still burning, and they're going to continue to burn beyond the next few days. But whether we see impacts here in Baltimore or along the eastern seaboard has a lot to do with where the wind is blowing at any given time. And so you can always check the current and forecasted air quality for where you are on the airnow.gov site, which is a great resource for people. I like to check air quality like I check the weather in the morning and kind of see what to expect throughout the day. In the longer term, I think we should be thinking about this also in the context of climate. Is this the new normal? We know that a warming planet is going to make wildfires more common. And so the question is, are events like this going to become a little bit more, we're going to see these more? I hope not. It's not great. It's not a great way to start the summer. But this is something that seems to be happening. The fire season starts earlier and ends later. And so we may see more impacted days like we've seen the last few. And then finally, I just wanted to mention that it's really important to note that although we've had a few days of disruption with really poor air quality, that the levels that we're seeing here are not really unusual for many parts of the world. And so we're fortunate being here to have generally pretty good air quality, although we do want to avoid kind of what we've been seeing the last couple of days.
Thanks, Pete. Kirsten, I'll turn to you. What exposures should individuals be concerned about when they're outdoors right now? Can they be doing something to mitigate any exposures?
As Pete mentioned, it's a little bit better today, but what we're primarily concerned about is particulate matter, or what we might call PM 2.5. These are small particles in the air, much smaller than you can see, and The wildfire smoke particles are particularly small, meaning they can go deep into your lungs and interact with your respiratory system and potentially even impact the other systems in your body. So as Pete mentioned, airnow.gov is a great resource that people can use to keep an eye on the current air quality, as well as it provides 2-day forecasts that can allow you to plan for the upcoming days and whether you might want to change your activities. But individuals can take action to reduce their exposure. You may have heard over the last couple of days that we really recommend trying to stay indoors with your windows closed as much as possible. If you can, you could run your air conditioner and or an air purifier to try to improve your indoor air quality as well. You might want to double check your filters if you haven't replaced them in a while and upgrade them to the highest, what we call MERV rating that your system can accommodate. This will provide the best filtration for your indoor air quality. If you must go outside, we still recommend using a mask. The smoke particles can be smaller than what we were thinking about of the types of particles that carry COVID, but the general guidance that we were talking about over the last few years about mask wearing still holds for these types of events. So ideally, you would want to wear a tight-fitting mask, something like an N95 or a KN95. Surgical masks will provide some protection, but cloth masks will really provide minimal protection for these types of very small particles. If you have to be in your car or other vehicle, you can use the air conditioning and use your recirculation. That's the little button on your dash that looks like a kind of U-turn arrow. This sends the air through your filter repeatedly and limits how much outdoor air is coming into the cabin of your vehicle. So it can really reduce the particles that are coming into your vehicle. Another thing to consider is that when we think about the term exposure, we're not only talking about the current air quality conditions, but also how much air you're actually breathing. So limiting your time outdoors is, of course, an important piece of this, but also you could reduce your physical activity level to keep your respiration rate down. So instead of going for a run, you could try going for a walk, or if you can, exercise indoors, doing that instead. Even as conditions continue to improve over the weekend, hopefully everyone will continue to monitor the air quality through resources like airnow.gov. We're heading into the hot summer months, and so even as the smoke clears, we can still have high ozone days. Ozone is a respiratory irritant. It's a gaseous pollutant, and particularly individuals with asthma or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, or other lung conditions really might want to try to limit their time outdoors on those days. Ozone concentrations that are higher than usual may not be immediately visible like we've been seeing on these bad smoke days, so really monitoring those resources is the best way to know. But ozone concentrations tend to be the highest on hot sunny days and peak in the late afternoon. In fact, the ozone AQI during the last few days has been in the moderate zone as we had these very high PM levels. So really, you're getting exposures from multiple types of pollutants at the same time.
Thank you, Kirsten. Meredith, I'll turn to you before we move to Q&A. And before I do, I want to remind those who are watching, I see a lot of questions coming in. Please do continue to submit, and we will get through as many as possible when we move to Q&A with our experts. Meredith, you're a practicing physician. What advice are you giving to those who have asthma or other cardiopulmonary conditions right now?
Thanks for that question. We have been getting a lot of questions from our patients. And as a lung doctor and also as a researcher, I think a lot about air pollution and how it affects lung health as well as our overall health. And we know that air pollution, including air pollution from wildfire smoke, is harmful for any individual, but is especially harmful for people that have an underlying health condition. And so I think a lot about my patients with asthma and COPD. And we know that spikes in air pollution can provoke asthma attacks or COPD exacerbations. And they've also been linked to things like heart attacks or worsening of heart failure. So especially for those who have an underlying health condition, we really want to protect everyone and pay special attention to making sure that those individuals who have health concerns reduce their risk of exposure. We also think about children and older adults as groups that may be especially susceptible to the adverse effects of air pollution. And so those are other groups, including pregnant women, that we want to make sure to reduce risk of exposure and protect from harmful health consequences. Some of the things that I'm telling my patients, just some practical things, are to make sure if they're supposed to be taking medications, and sometimes patients and all of us forget to take our medications, that they pay special attention to taking their regular medications. And for my patients with lung conditions, that means things like their inhaled medications and their inhalers or nebulizers or therapies that are specifically targeting, for example, asthma. Um, Often patients have rescue medications as well, inhalers they may use when their symptoms are worse. And I want to make sure they have those on hand. And for anyone, really making sure that they have the supplies and medications that they may need. And as we're going into the weekend, it's always good to make sure that any refills are completed, and so that you have what you need on hand to take care of your health needs. Sometimes patients ask what signs should they be looking for. And so from a breathing standpoint, if you're having an increase in cough, increase in phlegm, feeling like chest constriction or pressure, those might be symptoms that could be provoked by exposure to air pollution. So symptoms to pay attention to, and think about whether you have an action plan because you have a health condition, or whether those are symptoms that might make you think about reducing your exposure, and or if they're significant enough to go to urgent care or to an emergency department. Pete and Kirsten mentioned airnow.gov, which is a great resource. And for health-related resources, I also really like to point people to the American Lung Association. Lung.org has great resources, information about air pollution health effects. NRO Breathe Center here, breathecenter.org, describes some of the work we've been doing and thinking about air pollution health effects and how we can protect our individuals and our communities.
Thanks, Meredith. We'll move to Q&A now. As I said, I do see a lot of questions coming in, and we'll get through as many as we possibly can. Meredith, I'm going to send this first one to you.
Sure.
So several folks asking about concerns that they have either for themselves or members of their household who are frontline workers or who have jobs that require them to work outside. How concerned should they be? And is it indeed safe for individuals to be working outside for extended periods right now?
Thanks for that question. One, as Pete mentioned, we're seeing improvement in air quality. So I think that's encouraging as we're going into the weekend. And again, we can continue to update our own understanding of air quality and how it may influence anyone, including workers, by checking in, because it does change over time. And one thing that we've been talking about is because of COVID, so many of us have become accustomed to wearing masks and have masks on hand. And particularly in occupational workplace settings, masks sometimes are part of people's job and have been for a long time. But working outside is a great example of how using an N95 or a KN95 really may provide the ability to continue working and also be protected at the same time. And I will say, while the N95 offers the most protection, a KN95 also provides a nice option that for some people may be a little bit more comfortable, but it is also quite effective at filtering particles.
Thanks, Meredith. Kirsten, given your expertise, I wanted to give you a chance. Anything you'd like to add to this question about those who work outdoors for extended periods of time?
I agree with Meredith. And use of masks is a great option, particularly for people who have to be outdoors, for an 8 or longer hour work shift. Another thing as we head into the weekend and longer, that, people may have other types of work that they're doing outside that may be a little bit more flexible, and air quality is not necessarily the same throughout the course of the day. So it's, a good idea to kind of keep an eye on things like, can you, if the air quality is really poor in the morning, for example, like it was yesterday, it was much worse in the morning than it was in the late afternoon. Perhaps you could pick a time of the day to do those outdoor activities that have to be done when the air quality will be better.
Thanks. Pete, question for you. You mentioned in your opening remarks that what we're experiencing right now in parts of North America, something that happens in other parts of the world on a frequent basis. So given that, and also episodes that many of us remember from last year attributed to wildfires, how much is this part of the new normal?
I mean, ideally, we figure out ways to make it not part of the new normal, but that, I think, gets into discussions about how we try to deal with climate change and climate change going forward. I think what is also unique about this is that we've seen, now on the East Coast, where we have some of the highest population density in the country, almost 90 million people impacted at a given time from these wildfire episodes from Canada. What's happening frequently in the Mountain West and the Western US is people seeing these types of air quality days more frequently, but not hitting necessarily the same swath of population. So, moving forward, we have to think about how we attack climate change as a way to try to reduce these types of incidents from going forward. But the reality is that's a very slow process. And so, in the next few years, this may become something that we see, hopefully not on the Eastern seaboard as much, but it's certainly happening across the country for other reasons.
Thanks. Several questions about pets. I'll give each of you a chance to respond. If you have a pet, what are you doing right now in terms of outdoor time for that pet? And if you don't, just what are your general recommendations? And so we'll poll the panel. Kirsten, I'll start with you. I think
one of these days we'll learn. My recommendations for pets, I guess, are the same as my recommendations for people. Limiting time outdoors. Can you take a walk instead of taking your dog for a jog? Maybe less vigorous fetch than you might have done on other days. I know some dogs really need lots of exercise, but maybe have a basement or something that you could do that on one day, or pick up the breakable items. But I would say we're probably not going to get the dogs to wear masks. So really limiting their time and their activity level outdoors, during these really extreme events is what I would recommend.
Thanks, Kirsten. And Pete and Meredith, do either of you have a pet? And would you share what you are doing right now relative to your pet?
I don't have a pet, but just kind of echoing what Kirsten said, I don't think there are any pet-specific masks on the market, but maybe that's a niche thing that someone with good business chops may want to pursue if this becomes more normal. Yeah.
There's no way I could get my dogs to wear them.
We have a dog, our dog Sammy. We followed the recommendations we were trying to put in place for our children, and also limited his time outdoors. But as Kirsten mentioned, it's hard because there's something beneficial for all of us being outdoors and being active. So just trying to balance that.
Understood. Thank you. Kirsten, several questions coming in that relate to your opening remarks and air filtration systems, and what are your thoughts about alternatives, given that some of those things can be expensive for individuals that may be concerned about purchasing equipment that they don't have right now?
Yeah, if you don't have an air purifier, the EPA and some other resources have recommendations for how you can kind of make an air purifier with a box fan that you may already own, and adding to that one or more filters. Pete, I think, actually has an example of one that he could hold up. But basically, these are using the same types of filters that you would put into your HVAC system. So you can see the pleated filters there. You hopefully are swapping those out in your home HVAC system. If you aren't, you should be. And you can add those to just a simple box fan that you may already have in your house to provide an extra level of protection. That one uses a few filters to try to give the highest benefit, but even just putting one taped to the back of a box fan will provide a lower cost air filtration option.
Thanks, Kirsten. And a follow-up to that, is this something that you recommend households do all the time, or only right now or in the next several days?
So Meredith and I work on a number of studies as part of the Breathe Center that she mentioned before, where we really are focused on how indoor air quality affects individuals, and specifically those with conditions like asthma or COPD. And so we find that indoor air quality is often worse than an outdoor air quality on a more typical day. And this is because indoors people have lots of different sources. There may be smoking, cooking, using of candles or incense or other kind of combustion, burning of sources. And so if your indoor air quality is kind of being impacted by any of these sources, then running an air purifier or one of these kind of homemade air purifiers can be beneficial. Other, things to consider are not allowing people to smoke in your home, opening windows while you cook to allow for good ventilation during those types of events, and minimizing candle and incense use when you can. Those will improve your indoor air quality all the time.
Thanks, Kirsten. Meredith, I want to give you a chance to jump in since Kirsten mentioned that you work on these issues together.
Sure. And I think the homemade air purifiers, air cleaners are a great resource, especially for people that may not have them or they may be hard to come by during these episodes where we have high pollution and it's on the mind of the public. We get a lot of questions about buying air cleaners for the home. And often people ask, and Kirsten and I have done a lot of work on this, which brand would you recommend? And in general, what I recommend is looking for an air cleaner that has a HEPA filter and maybe also a carbon filter or other filters, and then really looking at the specs of your room. And so aligning what room you're going to put the air cleaner in, and looking at just what's on the box as far as the recommendations. And finally, making sure that you change the filters in your central air conditioning, as well as any air cleaners that you have that are standalone, as is suggested, because they're only as good as the filters that are within them. And also some of them can just be cleaned rather than exchanged. So sometimes rather than buying a new one, you can clean the existing one. And so those are important considerations.
Thanks, Meredith. Pete, I'm sensing that you have something to contribute here as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to pitch the idea that those DIY air cleaners are a great at-home activity with your kids when you're stuck inside in wildfire smoke. If you just have one filter on hand, it's just a little bit of duct tape and a box fan. If you have a bunch, then you can build a kind of cube. We do that in the undergrad course that I teach to kind of understand indoor air quality and how we can fix it. Building on what Kirsten and Meredith both said, the key things for an indoor air purifier are really that HEPA filtration. I really want to emphasize that. We don't need any kind of electronic air cleaning that can often cause additional problems. And then the one other piece, there's the volume of air it cleans, but then also the noise. If you're running these in your bedroom, you want them to be as quiet as possible. And so those are kind of the aspects of the air cleaner that are really important. But highly recommend having little fun activity, arts and crafts times with your kids if you've got them at home and stuck inside to build your own box. And it's a good experience.
Thanks, all. Meredith, you touched on this in your opening remarks, but I want to come back to it because we have several members of our audience asking about symptoms that they're experiencing. So if someone who doesn't have an underlying condition, or at least they're not aware of it, and in the last couple of days they found themselves coughing or their eyes are burning, should they assume that they can attribute it to what's going on in the environment right now?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I've gotten a lot of questions, and a lot of our patients are having eye irritation. So I do think we're seeing that a little bit more. And someone asked me yesterday if I start to have symptoms, is it too late? And I think it's really important to be mindful of symptoms. So often people might have a little bit of a sensation of discomfort or like a tickle in their throat or a mild cough. And that's I think a very important cue that your body may be giving you to pay attention to exposure and try to reduce exposure. And I think if you do have an underlying condition like asthma, think about making sure you're using those inhaler medications that you may be prescribed. And if you don't, that may be a clue to try to reduce exposures, spend more time indoors, and then also track that symptom. And if it's really starting to increase, think about calling your primary care or going to an urgent care. I think those would be some pieces of advice for how to monitor symptoms.
Thanks, Meredith. Pete, question for you. For the lay public who can, we see there's stuff in the air right now and we realize it's not good. How does what's happening right now compare to when you walk through a cloud of smoke from someone who's smoking or vaping, or when you inhale smoke that's coming off of a grill?
That's a great question. I mean, I think there's a couple points to hit there. The difference between now, or what we've experienced over the last few days, is that you can't really escape it. It was everywhere. And even in your home, you're still getting it coming in through your home. And so unlike a grill or a campfire or someone smoking that you walk through that cloud, that's a very, very short duration exposure. It's not a continuous thing. And as someone who grew up with asthma, the longer exposures tended to be things that I had a lot more difficulty with. You can always hold your breath a little bit if you see something and you can walk through it, but you can't do that when it's everywhere. And then the other piece is the composition. So this is wildfire smoke. And so it's basically trees burning. Different sources of air pollution in different places have different components. Some of the wildfire issues in California in the last few years included whole towns burning, which is incredibly awful because people are losing their possessions. But it also means that the composition of the smoke was different too. When your home burns, when appliances burn, when electronics burn, there's a bunch of other chemicals that can be associated with that can even be worse than just trees burning. The heavy metals involved in the electronics, and so it's important to think about that as well. Fortunately, this is really just open forest, and we're not getting all those heavy metals incorporated into the smoke that could add additional health risks. So in that sense, we're fortunate, but it's something that we definitely want to avoid breathing if we can at all.
Thanks, Pete. And I'm going to stay with you for this next question, which concerns the air quality index, and you and our other panelists have mentioned it. Can you explain a little bit of what's behind those numbers? So what you're actually learning when you go to one of the websites that you recommended?
Yeah. This is a conversation I think that Kirsten and I have had many, many times. And so I'm speaking for me, but also based on conversations I've had with Kirsten and other colleagues. The air quality index is a way to make things like micrograms per meter cubed a little bit more understandable. So when we measure the concentration of particulate matter outside, we measure how much mass of those particles per volume of air. And that's really important from a science perspective, but a lot of people don't really care how many micrograms per meter cubed there are. But we understand scales from 0 to 100 and numbers above 100 being worse. And so the air quality index is a way to kind of base our understanding of how clean the air is on a more understandable scale for the general public. One of the issues or one of the discussions that we've had, and Kirsten and I had this discussion yesterday, was the air quality index just takes the highest of the two values. Kirsten mentioned ozone being another key pollutant in the summertime. What happens is whichever one's higher, you use that number for the air quality index, but you don't understand that those can also build off each other and make the air quality worse. And so ozone wasn't great the last couple of days either, but particulate matter was so bad that it dominated. But that higher level of ozone is also probably something that's detrimental. And when it mixes with the particle pollution being that high, it can add additional health burdens to the body. And perhaps Meredith and Kirsten can speak more to how those things can work together. But that's how the scale works. It's a 0 to 100 scale is okay, and then above that you start to get in what we consider unhealthy.
Thanks, Pete. And Kirsten and Meredith, would you like to jump in?
I would just suggest, the AQI is published as a single number, but you can see for both of them if you go to airnow.gov. So, you might, take both of those into account and think like the highest one today might be particles, but if the ozone AQI is only a little bit lower, then, kind of keeping in mind, like really both of these have a potential to impact, and particularly for these kind of susceptible individuals we've been talking about, really kind of keeping both of those pieces in mind. And ozone has a very strong diurnal pattern with highest concentrations in the late afternoon. So, you might think about whether you could run errands or do different things that you need to do outdoors, not during those peak ozone hours, particularly if there's also high PM that day.
Thanks, Kirsten. Meredith, anything to add on this one?
Yeah, I would just underscore, just like what you said, the AQI isn't additive. So looking at each component separately is important. And then a lot of it's really great resources. A lot of individuals now have the ability to monitor their own air quality in their home. Like the Purple Air device is more and more commonly used. And just to comment that device specifically and many others really are focused on particles. So like what Kirsten and Pete said, understanding ozone and the ozone patterns in your area, which are typically higher in the afternoon, especially in these summer months, is another key component to understanding your own exposures and that of your family and your community.
Thanks, Meredith. And I'm going to stay with you. Several questions coming in asking if you could speak to why people should be concerned about these exposures relative to what could be happening in their lungs if they're inhaling small particles. So I think we've covered what can happen, but what's, from a medical perspective, what's the why?
Sure. We know that any kind of particle really can enter the body. And one thing I don't know that any of us has said yet is that these particles we're talking about, the PM 2.5s, are small. They're small enough to get into the body, and they can be inhaled deeply into the lungs. And within the small, what we define as small particles, there are even smaller particles that can go all the way and cross into the bloodstream. And so sometimes people wonder about how can you have effects just beyond lung effects? And that's because these particles really can enter the body and create health consequences for the heart, for the brain, for the endocrine system, people with diabetes. We're learning more and more that there are multi-system effects of particle pollution, and also that the lower the better. So we're all talking about it today because there's been this dramatic event, but to optimize our health, really as low as we can get our exposure over a lifespan, the better. And I think we saw that increased attention over time to how to create resilience as well as decrease risk of disease. And this is one strategy that's important at the individual level, but given climate change and what we anticipate to happen in the future, really important to think of ways we can be strategic globally as well as at an individual level to protect our health.
Thanks, Meredith. Kirsten, question about something you mentioned in your opening remarks about how air conditioners can be used in a safer way to avoid bringing pollutants into one's home. Can you speak about that a bit more?
Yeah, so when you have your air conditioning running with your windows open, some systems have the ability to reduce the amount of outdoor air that comes in. Even if it doesn't, your air conditioning system should have a filter on it. And so buying the highest rated filter that your system can accommodate is a great option to make sure that when you're bringing in some air from the outdoors, that it's being filtered. Much of the air will be recirculated, and so that improves your air conditioning efficiency. And so you can kind of try to keep the indoor air as clean as we can compared to what's happening outside.
Thanks. Pete, several questions coming in, and the gist is, when will this haze subside? So my question for you is not to predict the future, but is that the right question for people to be asking themselves right now?
That's a good question. I think it's a very local question for people who and where they live. These fires are not being extinguished. What's going to help extinguish those fires is probably rain. So the question is, where is the smoke going? And that just has to do with meteorology and which way the weather patterns are going. And we've been unfortunate in the sense that there's basically been a couple pressure systems that are channeling that smoke to us on the eastern seaboard and a little bit now into the Midwest over the last few days. And that those weather systems are kind of pushing out east, which is what usually happens kind of just generally for weather systems. And so that smoke is not going to be impacting us as much, but it's going to be hitting other parts of Canada and then blowing across the Atlantic. And so the smoke here will subside, but that means it's probably going elsewhere until those fires go away. And right now, there's just an unprecedented fire season that started very early in Canada this year. And so if that continues, we're really at the front end of what is the fire season. There may be other incidences in the future. And so while this smoke subsides, the next round may be around the corner.
Thanks, Pete. And I'm going to send this next question to each of you. So we're in this acute moment right now. We can literally see that the air is polluted, but hopefully within the next few days, we'll have better air quality conditions. Each of you is an expert in this. On a day-to-day basis right now, separate from the current crisis, what are you most concerned about relative to air quality? And Meredith, I'm going to send this to you first, but we'll go through each of our panelists.
I think on a day in and day out basis, there's a real opportunity to reduce air pollution related to traffic sources. So electrification of our transportation system is a real opportunity. And the other thing that I worry about, or I think about where we can make improvements, relates to where people live, and specifically environmental justice, and the fact that in this country, we're not all equally, we don't have equal access to clean air in our communities. And so thinking about urban planning and other ways that we can really ensure that everyone has access to clean air.
Thanks, Meredith. Kirsten, same question to you.
Yeah, I guess I would kind of echo what Meredith was saying in that as we think about these kind of environmental justice issues of whether people in different communities and perhaps even within the same city have the same exposure. One thing I think a lot about is beyond kind of these what we call criteria air pollutants, the air pollutants that are regulated by the US EPA, are other pollutants that are not measured as routinely, that are often quite expensive to measure, things like volatile organic carbon compounds. And so these, can be perhaps even more diverse in concentrations, have higher peaks in some areas. And so I think Pete and I have also talked about this a lot of times of, even if PM 2.5, something you can measure with a low cost sensor like a purple air, isn't as different between two communities, other pollutants could still be important. The other thing that I continue to think about is as we have improving air quality, I think a lot of people will think like, oh, the air quality is so much better than when I was a kid. And yes, that's true. But to Meredith's point earlier, the research continually shows that there's no safe level of exposure to PM 2.5. And so really like continuing to improve our air quality has benefits for everybody. So, we shouldn't get complacent and continue to work on policies that can improve air quality.
Thanks, Kirsten. And Pete, same question to you, and you will have the last word in this briefing.
I mean, I think my colleagues have hit a lot of the high notes, and so I want to reemphasize some of the points that they brought up. I mean, air quality is something that it makes sense to continually improve. We spend the majority of our time inside, so thinking about our indoor air quality and not just what's outdoors. And I think in the context of the wildfires that we've just seen, we were fortunate in a sense that the temperatures during the day were actually quite low. And so keeping our doors and windows closed was possible. There's a large population that doesn't have air conditioning. And so should these fires happen later in the summer when temperatures peak out in the upper 90s into the hundreds, keeping your windows and doors shut is something that's really difficult to do if you want to stay cool. And so opening your windows and doors means you're going to be exposed to the levels of air quality and the air pollution that's outdoors, pretty much universally inside. And so thinking about and making sure we have infrastructure for not only cooling centers, but clean air centers in areas that are going to be impacted going forward, I think is something that's really important to think about and plan for going forward. Again, this is something we think about on this panel every day as part of our jobs. And so recommendations and ways to minimize the impacts to our own air quality involve my wife being mad at me that she can no longer burn candles in our home, but we don't burn candles in our home anymore. And we don't have a fireplace that we use or a wood stove that we use because those add additional burdens to our indoor environment. And so some of those behavioral changes and just thinking about those things when we're in our homes are going to be ways that we reduce the exposure for not only us, but our kids and things like that.
Thanks so much. I'd like to thank Pete DeCarlo, Kirsten Koehler, and Meredith McCormack for joining me today. And I'd also like to give a big thank you to everyone who attended this briefing, and especially to those who submitted questions for our experts to answer. A recording of this event will be made available on this website. Today's panelists, together with many faculty from across Johns Hopkins, will continue to work on issues like air quality that impact all of our futures. Thank you again for joining us.